Welcome, everyone, to CNU Talks live at lunch this September. We are so glad to have you here today. My name is Grace Charlene Marks, and I am a class of 2021 alumni here at Christopher Newport, and I'm also your Assistant Director of Alumni Relations. Today is brought to you by the Alumni Society Board of Directors, as well as your Office of Alumni Engagement. And we are so honored today to have Dr. Jonathan White joining us. He is a professor here at at Christopher Newport University for American Studies. Not only that, he is an author and editor of over 20 books and more than 100 articles, essays, and reviews about Abraham Lincoln, the Civil War, slavery and emancipation, and the U.S. Constitution. And not only that, he includes his own student researchers in many of these projects, which gives them an invaluable experience. He is also a distinguished lecturer for the Organization of American Historians, serves on the board of directors of the Abraham Lincoln Institute and the Abraham Lincoln Association, and is the vice chair of the Lincoln Forum. He also serves on the Ford's Theater Advisory Council, the editorial board of the Pennsylvania Magazine of History and Biography, and is the editor of both the Lincoln Lore and the Lincoln Forum Bulletin. Even with all of these commitments, he still makes time to invest in our students here and provide a space for them to learn and build their passion for education, American history, law, and of course, Abraham Lincoln. I myself got to be a student with Dr. White, and he was actually one of my very first professors when I was a freshman, and it is what sold me on learning more about American history and American studies. So I'm really excited to have him joining us today. As always, he will get to share with us for a period of time, and afterwards there will be time for Q&A, which you can drop below in the box. Other than that, we're going to turn it over to him. And so thank you so much, and the floor is yours, Dr. White.
Oh, well, thank you so much, Grace. Thank you for inviting me. I have fond memories of having you in class many, many moons ago now. So next week, I'm going to publish my 21st book, and it's called Measuring the Man, The Writings of Frederick Douglass on Abraham Lincoln. And this book consists of everything that Frederick Douglass ever wrote or said about Lincoln. It includes a lot of things that are familiar to historians, but then it also includes about a dozen new documents that I discovered actually doing research right here in my office at Christopher Newport University. And so I'm going to tell you a little bit about that book. But before I do that, I wanted to give you some background on how this book came about, because a lot of times research can be serendipitous. And so you start with one topic or one idea, and then eventually it takes you somewhere else, and you wind up in a completely different place. So about 2014, I had the idea to write a history of the transatlantic slave trade during the Civil War. And there have been a number of people who've written about the slave trade in the years leading up to the war, but during the war, it hasn't had as much attention. And in 2015, a student research assistant of mine, a student named Daniel Glenn, was working for me as a summer scholar through Orca. And I gave Daniel a list of names of people that I wanted him to research, people who I knew were slave traders. And so I said, I want you to go into newspapers.com and other databases, see what you can find out about these men who I have. And one day, Daniel came into my office right here, and he said, have you ever heard of Appleton Oaksmith? And I said, Appleton Oaksmith, like that's the weirdest name I've ever heard in my life. No, why? And he said, well, his name keeps coming up in all these searches. And as you know, I said, well, add him to the list of names and keep doing research on him as well. And so throughout the summer of 2015, Daniel continued to do research on the other slave traders and then on Appleton Oaksmith. And Appleton's story wound up being so interesting that I ended up kind of jettisoning the idea of a book on the slave trade as a whole. And I wrote a biography of Appleton Oaksmith called Shipwrecked. And I couldn't have done this book without my student, Daniel. Now, as I was researching this book, I spent a lot of time at the National Archives going through pardon records. And I was looking for letters from slave traders to Abraham Lincoln having to do with, I've been convicted in federal court of some sort of act related to the slave trade, and will you pardon me, or will you show me clemency? Will you let me out of jail early? And as I began looking through those letters, I began to sort of review a lot of the case files and sort of go through all of them. And I found that actually a number of African Americans were writing to Lincoln seeking pardon. And these are letters that scholars had never really looked at before, because most scholars of Black history don't look at the pardon records at the National Archives in College Park. And that got me thinking, I wonder how many other Black men and women wrote to Lincoln. And over the course of several years, while I was writing Shipwrecked, I ended up collecting 125 letters from Black men and women to Lincoln, some who were born free, some who were born into slavery. About 120 of them are from men, about 20 of them are from women, and they write to Lincoln about whatever's going on in their lives and whatever concerns them. And in a very real way, they were claiming the rights of the First Amendment, that they had a right to petition the government for a redress of grievances. And so I collected those 125 letters into a book called To Address You as My Friend. And so again, like, I started with the slave trade and slave traders, and then it led to a collection of letters by African Americans. And as I was working on To Address You as My Friend, I realized that many of the letters were actually personally delivered to Lincoln, that Black men and women decided that they would be courageous and go to the White House, usually unannounced and uninvited, and go into Lincoln's office and actually say, like, here's my petition, or here's my letter, here's what I want to talk about. And I believe that hundreds of Black men and women met with Abraham Lincoln during the Civil War in Washington, D.C., and many of these meetings took place in Lincoln's White House office. And so, as an outgrowth of To Address You as My Friend, I wrote a book called A House Built by Slaves, African American Visitors to the Lincoln White House. And in this book, I trace the stories of the men and women who very boldly went to the White House and said, you know, this is our people's house too. This is our president. We have a right to go talk to him about whatever is on our minds. And this was a story that had really been lost for 160 years. People had lost sight of the fact that during this 4-year period of Lincoln's presidency, Black men and women were welcomed into the White House, and they talked with Lincoln about anything they wanted to. Well, one of the African Americans who both wrote to Lincoln and met with Lincoln was Frederick Douglass. And Douglass sent two letters to Lincoln, both of them written on the same day in August of 1864. And he met with Lincoln 3 times. He met Lincoln in August of 1863, again in August of 1864, and then at Lincoln's second inauguration in March of 1865. And so Douglass was a major figure in A House Built by Slaves, and Douglass came up and To Address You as My Friend. And I teach Frederick Douglass almost every semester here at CNU. In American Studies 100, my students read something Douglass wrote about women's rights in 1848. And in that class, they also read his very famous speech, What to the Slave is the 4th of July. And then in my American Studies 120 class, which is called Encounters with the Constitution, my students read a speech that Douglass gave in 1860 in Glasgow, where he makes the case that the Constitution is an anti-slavery document. And so in my research, I've been thinking a lot about Frederick Douglass. And then in my teaching, I've been trying to get my students to think a lot about Frederick Douglass. And last summer, I had the idea of pulling together a collection of everything that Frederick Douglass ever wrote about Abraham Lincoln. And I approached a friend of mine named Lucas Morell. He's the chair of the politics department at Washington and Lee. And he is a Lincoln scholar and a Douglass scholar. In fact, his Twitter handle is at Lincoln Douglass. So I figured he's like the perfect person to work with. And so I called Lucas and I said, hey, I have this idea to put together a collection of all of Douglass's writings on Lincoln. Or actually, I should say the original idea was to do kind of the highlights, like um, what are the most important documents, especially thinking about what would students find interesting. And so we were envisioning kind of a short book, maybe about 40,000 words. And one day last summer, I was in Tribble Library and I pulled a book off of the shelf, and I saw that Douglass was writing letters to British abolitionists, and that some of these letters were getting leaked into British newspapers. So for a very quick backdrop, Douglass had to escape, put himself in exile from the United States in the mid to late 1840s after he published his first autobiography because he was a fugitive slave and his slave owner wanted to hunt him down and bring him back to Maryland. And so Douglass went over to the UK, and while he was there, he made a number of friends among the British abolitionist circles. And those friends ended up purchasing Douglass's freedom so that he could return to the United States without fear of being recaptured and sent back into bondage. But then they became lifelong friends and they corresponded for the next 50 years. And so during the Civil War, Douglass was writing letters to these British abolitionists, and some of them were getting put into British newspapers. And some of those letters had been found by the editors of the major volumes of the Frederick Douglass papers, which we have here at Tribble Library. And so I was looking at one of these volumes and I thought, wow, I wonder if there are more letters that haven't been discovered yet. And one of the wonderful things about being a historian in this age is that we have digital newspaper sources and other digitized sources that make millions of pages available within a matter of seconds. And so I came back into my office here in McMurrin Hall and I logged into newspapers.com and a couple of other databases. And I began to search in British newspapers for different iterations of Frederick Douglass's name. So I was looking for, I would spell his first name with or without a K at the end, or I would spell his last name with or without two S's at the end, because editors back then, in England, they may not know how to spell his name. And so I wanted to make sure that I didn't leave any stone unturned. And sitting right here last summer, or 2 summers ago now, I uncovered 9 letters that Frederick Douglass wrote that had not been seen for 160 years. And these letters really changed the way that we think about the relationship between Frederick Douglass and Abraham Lincoln. And so what began as like a very short book, 40,000 words, just hitting the highlights, Lucas Morell and I decided we need to make it comprehensive. We need to include everything. And so in Measuring the Man, we include every statement written by Frederick Douglass that we could find. Uh, from 1858 until a year before Douglass died, he died in 1895. The last document we have is from 1894. And they really tell an incredible picture. And included among those documents are the new letters we found, plus a couple of other new documents that we located. And so I'll just give you a very brief overview of sort of Lincoln and Douglass and their relationship and some of the new stuff that we found, and then we'll have some time for questions if you all are interested. So Frederick Douglass first became aware of Lincoln in 1858 when Lincoln was running for the U.S. Senate in Illinois, and Lincoln had very famous debates with Stephen Douglas that year for that seat. Lincoln lost that election, but his name started to become sort of a national name. And Douglas read some of the speeches that Lincoln wrote in 1858, and Douglas was impressed. But when Lincoln ran for president in 1860, Douglas began to have different thoughts on Lincoln. And this was rooted in their view of the Constitution. Frederick Douglass believed that the Constitution was an anti-slavery document, and if you just had an anti-slavery president in office, they could get rid of slavery. Lincoln's view was very different. Lincoln believed that the Constitution was a compromise between pro and anti-slavery forces. He believed that the founders wanted slavery to eventually disappear, but he believed that the Constitution protected slavery in the states that wanted to have it. And Lincoln also believed that federal law required him to recapture fugitive slaves. So when Lincoln gets elected, Frederick Douglass looks at him and he says, the South has no reason to secede. Like they've got nothing to worry about because Lincoln will be the South's greatest slave hound and abolitionism's worst enemy. And so Douglass is very critical of Lincoln very early in the war. Douglass wants Lincoln to end slavery immediately, and that's something that Lincoln just won't do. Well, over the course of the next 2 years, Lincoln moves towards emancipation, and in 1863, he issues his Emancipation Proclamation. And Douglass is thrilled. He's elated. He's frustrated that it was so slow, but he's glad that it finally came. Well, The Emancipation Proclamation allowed for black soldiers to, or black men to join the army as soldiers. And Douglas very enthusiastically starts recruiting black men into the army. He allows two of his sons to go off and fight. But black soldiers do not get equal treatment, they don't get equal pay. And in fact, the Confederate government said that black men caught in uniform would be treated like slaves in insurrection, and they would either be executed or enslaved. And this infuriates Douglas. And so Douglas goes to the White House for the first time and meets with Lincoln. And Douglas went uninvited and unannounced. He didn't know if he'd be welcomed in or turned away, but Lincoln welcomed him in. He took his hand. They sat down together. They talked at length. And Douglas pressed Lincoln on these issues of inequality and Confederate military atrocities. And Lincoln said, eventually black soldiers will get equal pay. I can't do it right now. Political realities won't allow me to do it. And on the issue of Confederate atrocities, Lincoln said that if he could capture people, Confederate soldiers who killed black men on the field when they were surrendering, that he would punish them. But he didn't believe he should punish Confederate POWs who had not committed a war crime. And if you know anything about Frederick Douglass, you would know that he was not altogether satisfied with these answers, but he went away with a new appreciation of the political realities that Lincoln was facing, that Lincoln just couldn't do anything he wanted to, that he was accountable to a Northern constituency, much of which was racist. And so Lincoln had to kind of move in sure and steady steps, but measured steps. Well, a year later, Lincoln is convinced he's going to lose in his bid for reelection. And the Union war effort was going very badly for the North in the summer of 1864. And Lincoln is convinced that he's going to lose. And Lincoln's concern is that when he loses, that the next president, a Democrat, will come in and rescind the Emancipation Proclamation, and the opportunity for black freedom will be gone. And so in August of 1864, a year after their first meeting, Lincoln actually sends word to Frederick Douglass, please come to the White House and meet with me. And the two men sit down together in the White House and discuss a way to free as many slaves as they can before Lincoln is out of office. And they basically concoct a plan where they will send bands of scouts into the Confederacy shouting to the enslaved, run away now while you still have the chance before your golden opportunity for freedom is gone. And fortunately, things took a turn for the better, and Lincoln sailed into reelection. But this moment transformed the way Frederick Douglass thought about Abraham Lincoln. Douglass could see in this moment that freeing the slaves for Lincoln was all about doing what was morally right and making as many people free as possible. It wasn't about military necessity or winning the war. It was just trying to tell as many people as possible, run away now while you still have the chance. And that gave Douglass a great appreciation for Lincoln. From that point forward, Douglass would actually come to see Lincoln as a friend. The final time they met was on the day of Lincoln's inauguration in March of 1865. Douglass went to the inauguration and watched the speech. He then went to the White House, and the police tried to keep Douglass out, but Douglass was able to get in. And Lincoln saw him, and Lincoln shouted, "Here comes my friend Douglass." And Douglass went up to Lincoln, and Lincoln said, "What did you think of my speech?" And Douglass said, "Oh, you've got a lot of important people here. My opinion doesn't matter." And Lincoln says, "There's no one whose opinion I value more than yours." And Douglass then tells Lincoln it was a sacred effort, that his second inaugural was a sacred effort. And so you can see this movement in how Lincoln and Douglass interact with each other, from Douglass being very hostile towards Lincoln early in the war to coming to see Lincoln as a friend by the end of the war. And that story is fairly well known. And that's the story that I tell in A House Built by Slaves. But then the new letters that I found and that Lucas and I found offer some new complexity to it. And so we're really excited about this book. And I know I'm only supposed to talk for about 20 minutes, so I probably only have about 3 or 4 minutes. So I'll just kind of hit some of the highlights. And then if people have more questions, I can talk about more during Q&A. So some of the earliest letters that I discovered have Douglass kind of reflecting on how emancipation came about. And as some of you may know, during the beginning of the Civil War, a lot of the Union generals were not very effective, and they lost battles or they weren't willing to fight. And this really frustrated a lot of radicals because radicals, Republicans, they wanted to conquer the South. And I discovered a letter that Douglas wrote in November of 1862, so right after Lincoln had announced his plan to free the slaves. And Douglas noted the irony of having these kind of pro-slavery, lethargic Union generals who won't attack the Confederacy. And the irony was, for Douglas, if they had fought more vigorously earlier in the war and if they had defeated the Confederacy too soon, emancipation would have never come on the table. And Douglas recognized that. So Douglas, who had wanted like much stricter, harsher fighting early on, recognized that in the end that might not have accomplished what he really wanted. Douglas was always focused on Black freedom and Black equality. And so another one of these letters I discovered has Douglas say something that's really shocking in a way, and that is that Douglas, by the midpoint of the war, now doesn't want the war to end. Douglas recognized that the Emancipation Proclamation was a war measure. And one of the big questions would be, what happens when the war ends? Does the Emancipation Proclamation become null and void? Or if you pull the armies out of the Confederacy, does that mean that slavery will be reinstated or that Black people will be subjugated in other ways? And so, in one of these letters to a British correspondent, Douglas says very candidly he doesn't want the war to end because he's terrified of what will happen with Reconstruction. And then the last one that I'll just mention now, and then we can turn to Q&A. Hopefully there's some questions in there. The last one is a letter I discovered from April 20th, 1865. So as many of you probably know, Abraham Lincoln was assassinated. He was shot on April 14th, 1865. He died the next morning at 7:22. And the nation had an outpouring of grief, and people, communities throughout the country have public meetings where they look to their local leaders to kind of explain for them, how do we make sense of what is happening? These are like vigils happening all over the country. And so Douglas speaks at two of these vigils in Rochester, New York, where he lived, and he talked about his personal friendship with Lincoln and his views of Lincoln and how kind Lincoln had been towards him and how Lincoln had treated him as an equal and never discriminated against him on account of the color of his skin. But I found a letter that Douglas wrote on April 20th, 1865, so 5 days after Lincoln died, to a British audience that was very different. And in this letter, Douglas again recounts how terrible it is that Lincoln has died. But then again, he's focused on the issue of Black freedom and Black equality. And so he says something to the Brits that he never would have said to an American audience. And that is that Lincoln had accomplished what he was destined to do, but it might actually be better for Black people that he had died. And the way Douglas kind of articulated this was, Lincoln had a sense of we've got to restore the Union. We are fighting for Union. We're fighting to prove that democracy can survive. And for Lincoln, that meant bring the Confederacy back into the Union, bring ex-Confederates back into their political rights. But for Lincoln, it also meant bring former slaves into political rights and give those former Confederates and former enslaved men the right to vote. And what Douglas worried about was that Lincoln would be too lenient towards the South. And Douglas believed, and not without reason, but Douglas believed that Andrew Johnson would actually punish the South. And so in this private letter that Douglas wrote on April 20th, he says, Lincoln has accomplished the great work that was set before him, but now it may be better that Andrew Johnson is president because he will go after the South. He will punish the planter class. And Douglas said, Johnson and Lincoln were both self-made men, and they were both born in slave states, but Lincoln moved to a free state when he was a young man, whereas Johnson stayed in the slave states his whole life. And so Johnson understood the importance of destroying both slavery and the slave power. And so Douglas said to this British audience, maybe it's better that Johnson will be president and that Lincoln is dead. I mean, that is an extraordinary thing to find someone like Douglas saying, and that letter has not been seen by anyone since 1865. Um, that's just a little bit about the book, and I'm very excited about it. It's something that my students have helped me with, and so I thank a number of students in the book for helping me with aspects of research and other things. And I will just say in closing, working with students here and mentoring them in research and getting them to be able to do original research of their own is one of the joys of being a professor at CNU. So, Grace, if we have questions, if you want to hop back in.
Absolutely. Thank you. And thank you so much. I was excited about this month just because I always enjoyed my classes with you when I was a student. So I feel very excited to be back in the classroom, if you will, for a minute. And I learned already so much. So very exciting and so cool to bring these letters into a conversation that has been had before. Like Frederick Douglass is respected and known, and now to bring this additional into the context is just super eye-opening. And so thank you so much for sharing with us.
Yeah.
Yeah, so one of the questions someone asked was, are there lessons to be learned from the Douglass letters? And there obviously are, but
Yeah.
lessons that transcend time, as they're equally applicable to today as they were then when he was writing these to Lincoln.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think so. One of the lessons that I think is really important, and this comes out in some of the documents in the book, and it certainly comes out in some of Lincoln's writings as well. Douglass was a very important defender of free speech. Douglass and Lincoln both were. And for both of these men, you need a First Amendment to protect unpopular speech. The abolitionists were some of the strongest defenders of free speech in the years before the Civil War, and that's because pro slavery people opposed free speech. Pro slavery forces believed that free speech, they would call it, to use today's parlance, they would call anti slavery or abolitionist speech, they would liken it to hate speech because they would say, well, you're trying to get enslaved people to rise up and hurt their enslavers and run away. And so the southern states passed a number of laws and other types of measures, and also anti-abolitionists used violence to try to stifle free speech. And so Douglass and Lincoln were very powerful uh, arguers on behalf of, you've got to protect the right of people to speak even if you disagree with what they think. And from their perspective, the hearer has a right. You'll never change your mind if you don't listen to people you disagree with. And so Douglass actually talked about the right of a hearer, that it's not even, free speech is not only about the right of the speaker, but it's also about the right of people to listen to opposing ideas and maybe change their mind or to sharpen their views. And so I think that is highly relevant to today's world. Another one, and this one comes out of one of the new letters that I discovered. It was a letter that Douglass wrote on September 1st, 1864, to this British audience, to a British abolitionist. And while Douglass came to appreciate Lincoln, Lincoln still wasn't his top choice for the presidency. Like, Douglass was a radical. Douglass wanted a radical president. And in the election of 1864, for a short while, there was actually a radical who ran against both Lincoln and the Democrat. And his name was John C. Fremont. And if Douglass could have had his way, he would have wanted Fremont to be the president. But this is a letter that I found, and it's in the book. It's the first time that anyone has ever seen this since 1864. And this is what Douglass says about the radical Fremont. He says, Fremont can get no votes and will, I think, be withdrawn from the canvass by his friends. Meaning, like, Fremont
Mhm.
can't win, and eventually his friends are going to convince him, like, you got to pull out of the race. You're going to split the Republican vote and cause the Democrat to win. And this is what Douglass says about him. He says, he is the fittest man, but has the fewest supporters. And though one man in the right is a majority against the whole world wrong, at the polls numbers rule. A candidate without a party may be sublime, but he cannot be successful. And then Douglass says, I nowadays am taking a more practical view of things than formerly. And he says, and hence I'm doing everything I can to secure Lincoln's election. So that's relevant too, because, we live in a two-party system just like they did then. And a lot of times people get frustrated with the parties, and they're like, they're not pure enough. They don't do what I want. And so I'm going to go start my own third party. I'm going to vote third party. Like I'll vote, on the left, I'll vote Green Party, or on the right, I'll vote Libertarian or Constitutional Party or something. And like Douglas by 1864 was learning the realities of politics. And the realities of politics are you have to win a majority. And if you run on a third party ticket at the national level, you're never going to win a majority. And what you wind up doing is splitting your own side and then causing the other side to win. And then you lose more than you would have otherwise.
Mhm.
And so that was when I found that letter, I was just floored by it because, again, we think of Douglas as a radical, which he was, but here he's saying, but I got to be practical. And I think that's a pretty good lesson too.
Yeah, wow. It's always one of my favorite things about learning about American history, about history in general, is as we see these themes that transcend time.
Mm-hmm.
And one, it's grounding, and sometimes to remember we're not alone or unique. Sometimes even in the challenges we face in current,
Yeah.
but also the reminder to look back and learn how people navigated them. Like we're not the first to do these things. So that's so interesting. I'm really excited. I'm excited now to read the rest of these letters, truthfully. I'm like, okay, I've got some historical reading to do again. So I'm very excited. We have another question come in asking, obviously, as you stated, Douglas had his reasoning, but do you find it odd that Douglas came to the conclusion that Johnson would do better to finish the job in the South over Lincoln?
That's a great question. And I should have said this. For those who don't know, Andrew Johnson wound up being lenient towards former Confederates and being very harsh towards former slaves. So Johnson was the exact opposite of what Douglas expected him to be. But to be fair to Douglas, and this is something we lay out in the book, and I meant to say, Douglas had good reason to expect Johnson to do what Douglas expected him to do. So Tennessee was exempted from the Emancipation Proclamation because Tennessee was under Union control, and Andrew Johnson became military governor of Tennessee. And it was Andrew Johnson who issued an Emancipation Proclamation ending slavery in Tennessee. So Douglas knew that. Douglas knew that Johnson had ended slavery in his home state. And in 1864, Johnson, of course, was the running mate with Lincoln. So he's the running mate of Lincoln while he's the military governor of Tennessee. And during the campaign, Johnson went out onto the Capitol steps in Nashville, and there was a large black crowd in front of him. And they had a back and forth. And as part of the back and forth, they said, "We need a Moses." And Johnson said, "I will be your Moses." So you have Johnson telling black people, "I will lead you out of slavery, out of the house of bondage, into the promised land." And again, Douglas knew that. And so Douglas expected this guy is going to be solid on black political rights. And then in 1865, Johnson comes out publicly and says ex-Confederates need to be punished. He says treason must be made odious. He says that ex-Confederates should lose property, like they should lose their property for their treason. And again, Douglas knows that. So Douglas expects Johnson is going to be favorable towards former slaves and he's going to be unfavorable towards the Southern elites. Well, Johnson doesn't do that. I mean, Johnson pardons every ex-Confederate and he does not favor black political rights. In February of 1866, so almost a year after Johnson becomes president, Douglas goes to the White House and meets with Johnson, and he pushes him, "You need to support black voting rights." And Johnson is having none of it. He's like, "Absolutely not." And when Douglas leaves the meeting, Johnson turns to someone and says that Douglas is just like any other N-word. He would slit a white man's throat as soon as he got the opportunity. And a week later, Frederick Douglass got to give a speech in honor of Lincoln's birthday in the House of Representatives chamber at the U.S. Capitol, which is the same chamber that Congress meets in today and that the State of the Union address is always given. So, like, Douglass stood up there to give this speech. And as part of that speech, with his meeting with Johnson fresh in his mind, he talked about what it was like to meet Lincoln and how Lincoln was always gracious and considerate and kind when meeting with him. And then he said, Lincoln wasn't like others. He didn't begin as a Moses and end as a Pharaoh. And that was a shot at Johnson that everyone would have understood there, because Johnson's the guy who said, I will be your Moses. And yet Johnson's the guy who then tries to keep black people down after the war. And that was unlike Lincoln. And for the rest of his life, Douglass will point to Lincoln, and especially point to those meetings with Lincoln and say, look, Lincoln treated me this way. White Americans should treat black Americans in a similar way.
Yeah. Mm. That's crazy he said that. That's wow, that's really cool. Thank you. Another question asking, can you explain what Douglass meant by it was a sacred effort regarding Lincoln's speech? Was he saying you did a good try, but you didn't still quite meet the mark?
Oh, it's a good question. No, it wasn't. It was a good try. So, Lincoln's second inaugural address is one of the most remarkable speeches in American history. If you go to the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C., it's carved up on the wall opposite of the Gettysburg Address. And when you read, I assign the second inaugural address every time I teach American Studies 100. So hundreds of my students have read it, and we spend a whole day looking at it. Um, in the speech, Lincoln quotes the Bible more than all the other inaugural addresses of all the preceding presidents combined. Like Lincoln was was reading scripture into this speech to try to make sense of the suffering of the war and what was God's purpose in all of this suffering and where do we need to go from here. And in fact, um, there, I forget who it was, maybe it was Douglass too, said it wasn't a state, it was more like a sermon than a state paper. Meaning, like, it didn't sound like a normal speech that a president would give for an inaugural address. Like, Lincoln was getting at something deeper. And so when Douglass called it a sacred effort, he was saying essentially, like, you have done something, you have accomplished something very deep in terms of understanding human nature and the war itself and where we need to go from here. And it was an absolute compliment on Douglass's part to say that.
Yeah, thank you. And so we'll do just one final question
Sure.
and a little bit shifting gears back to what you concluded with of talking about how you get to work with students at
Mm.
CNU. And so you mentioned those who have helped you. What are some of them doing now? And do you get to stay in touch with them after graduation and since they've left campus?
Yeah, I mean, I've stayed in touch with a lot of the students who've done research with me. I mentioned Daniel Glenn. He and I edited a book, gosh, like 8 years ago now. It's the letters of a student at Dickinson College. Daniel went on to law school at William and Mary. He then clerked for a federal judge and the chief judge in Richmond, and he is now an assistant U.S. attorney in Washington, D.C. So he works for the Department of Justice. I did another book with another student named Lydia Davis, now Lydia Hester. Did you know Lydia?
Yep, I was at her wedding.
You were at her
Big
wedding,
fan.
yeah.
Yep.
Okay, good. I wasn't able to make it. I was
Yeah.
invited, but I wasn't able to make it. Lydia and I did a book called My Work Among the Freemen, and it's the letters of a teacher um, for freed people during and after the Civil War. And Lydia then went into public history. She worked at Colonial Williamsburg for a while and then at the Mariners Museum across the street from campus. And now I think she's teaching at a school up in Williamsburg, although I know she is in a graduate program because I wrote a letter of rec for her. So I think it's for her teaching stuff, but
Yeah.
yeah, so she's doing great. And then I did another book that just came out earlier this year with a student named Reagan Connolly, and it's the diaries of a Civil War soldier who fought against Dakota Indians in Minnesota and then against Confederates in Mississippi. And Reagan is in her second year at George Mason Law School. So
Wow.
they've all gone on to do great things. And other students I've worked with who I mentored in research, some are at Virginia Historical Society. One's getting her PhD at the University of Toronto in political theory. A couple have gone on to become lawyers. So they've all gone on to do great things.
That's awesome. I remember because Daniel graduated after my first year at CNU, and then he gave us a tour of the Supreme Court that
That's
summer in
right.
DC, and that was so cool. That blew my historical mind, and that was such a cool opportunity that Daniel was able to like give us. So that was
Yeah.
awesome.
Yeah.
But no, that's awesome. Well, thank you so much, Dr. White, for joining us today and sharing with us and answering those questions. And thank you to everyone who joined us, and especially those questions, just digging a little deeper. So thanks for learning with us. Thank you for listening. Thank you for sharing. And we will return again next month in October, and this time with the Wasson Center. And they will be sharing with us about the current polling going on with the governor race here in Virginia, because it's going to be a tight one. And either way, we're going to end up with our first female governor here in the Commonwealth. So it's an exciting race to watch, and we hope that you will join us. So thank you again, and we'll be seeing you later.